Imagine standing before a city that should not exist. A shimmering, massive metropolis built entirely on a mountain lake, connected to the mainland by thin ribbons of stone, populated by hundreds of thousands of fierce warriors, and overflowing with more gold than European kings could even dream of. Now imagine you are standing outside its gates with just 500 exhausted, sweating, unwashed men, a dozen horses, and a few outdated cannons. By all the laws of math, military strategy, and basic human logic, you and every single man standing behind you are about to be slaughtered. Yet, within 2 years, that magnificent golden city will be reduced to ash, its god-king will be dead, and those 500 men will have erased one of the greatest military empires in human history. This is not a myth. This is the story of the most audacious, ruthless, and historically improbable gamble ever taken. This is the story of Hernán Cortés. To understand how a handful of men toppled a world, we have to throw away the traditional textbook image of Cortés as a grand, highly decorated general, sent on an official mission by the King of Spain. In the spring of 1519, Hernán Cortés was, for all practical purposes, a man on the run. He was an ambitious, silver-tongued magistrate living in Cuba, serving under Governor Diego Velázquez. When the governor authorized a small expedition to explore the mysterious uncharted coast to the west, Cortés lobbied furiously to lead it. But at the last second, suspecting that Cortés's towering ego would make him go rogue, the governor revoked his command. Cortés did what any rational megalomaniac would do. He completely ignored the order. He gathered 508 soldiers, 100 sailors, 16 horses, and slipped out of the harbor in the dead of night. He was no longer just an explorer. He was a man committing high treason. If he failed, the Spanish crown would put his head on a spike. He had to conquer, or he had to die. When the expedition finally landed on the scorching, swampy sands of the Gulf of Mexico, the crushing reality of their situation set in. The men were terrified. The local tribes were hostile, the heat was suffocating, and the sheer scale of the unknown continent was paralyzing. Whispers of a mutiny began to ripple through the camp. A faction of soldiers loyal to the Cuban governor hatched a plan to seize the ships and sail back to safety. Cortés answered this treason with one of the most legendary high-stakes psychological maneuvers in military history. He did not give a rousing speech. He gave a quiet order to his carpenters. He had the hulls of his own ships secretly bored full of holes, stripped them of their heavy rigging, and watched them sink into the shallow waters of Veracruz. The message to his 500 men was absolute. He pointed toward the ocean, and then he pointed toward the jagged mountains in the distance. There was no going back. The only way home was straight through the heart of whatever lay behind those peaks. As they began their brutal march inland, Cortés made a discovery that would change the fate of the human race. The Aztec Empire, or more accurately the Mexica Triple Alliance, was not a unified, peaceful nation. It was an iron-fisted, terrifying protection racket. For decades, the Mexica had subjugated the surrounding nations, demanding crushing tributes of food, luxury goods, and most horrifyingly to the locals, a constant stream of human captives to be sacrificed on the towering pyramids of the capital. The surrounding tribes hated their masters with a burning, generational fury. Cortés realized something fundamental. He did not need to defeat the millions of people living in Mesoamerica. He just needed to become the tip of their spear. But to do that, he needed to talk to them. Enter one of the most enigmatic and controversial figures in history, an enslaved indigenous woman gifted to the Spaniards, known to history as La Malinche. She possessed a genius-level intellect and spoke both Mayan and Nahuatl, the language of the Aztec elite. With her by his side translating, Cortés stopped being a blind, stumbling invader and transformed into a lethal political grandmaster. The ultimate test of this new diplomacy came when the Spaniards entered the territory of Tlaxcala, a fierce, proud kingdom that had successfully fought off Aztec conquest for over a century. The Tlaxcalans did not greet the Europeans with open arms. They ambushed them with tens of thousands of screaming warriors. For several days, the Spaniards fought a desperate, bloody war for their very survival, kept alive only by the impenetrable steel of their armor, the terrifying shock of their cavalry, and the rapid fire of their crossbows. But Cortés did something unusual. After every bloody skirmish, he released his Tlaxcalan prisoners with gifts and an offer of peace. When the Tlaxcalan generals realized that these strange, bearded aliens wanted to destroy the emperor of Tenochtitlan just as badly as they did, the weapons dropped. The bitterest of enemies became the deadliest of allies. When Cortés resumed his march toward the Aztec capital, he was no longer leading 500 lonely Spaniards. He was walking at the head of a massive, vengeful indigenous army. On November 8, 1519, the invaders finally crested the mountain pass, and the breath was knocked out of their lungs. Below them lay the vast valley of Mexico, and sitting in the center of a massive, shimmering silver lake was Tenochtitlan. One Spanish soldier later wrote in his memoirs that the men asked each other whether the things they were seeing were not a dream. It was a metropolis of roughly 200,000 people, larger than contemporary London, cleaner than Paris, organized into a brilliant grid of canals, floating botanical gardens, and towering white stucco pyramids that caught the morning sun. Waiting for them on the Great Southern Causeway was the emperor himself, Moctezuma II. Carried on a golden litter beneath a canopy of green feathers, his feet never allowed to touch the earth. The meeting of these two men was the silent collision of two separate human evolutions that had been completely isolated from one another for over 10,000 years. Moctezuma welcomed them into the city as honored ambassadors, housing them in the massive stone palace of his late father. It was a display of traditional Mesoamerican royal hospitality. It was also a fatal mistake. Within a week, the sheer claustrophobia of their reality caught up with the Spaniards. They were 500 men locked inside an island city, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of potential enemies. If the Aztecs simply lifted the wooden drawbridges connecting the city to the mainland, the Spaniards would be trapped in a gilded cage and slowly starved to death. Cortés decided to play the only card he had left: pure, unadulterated audacity. Taking his best armored captains, he walked into Moctezuma's private quarters, drew his sword, and placed the living divine ruler of the Aztec Empire under house arrest. For the next 6 months, the most powerful empire in the Americas was governed from behind a Spanish curtain. Moctezuma continued to issue orders to his people, but Cortés held the leash. It was a surreal, high-wire psychological balancing act that defied all known rules of power, and it was doomed to snap. The fragile illusion shattered in the spring of 1520. News reached Cortés that a massive, heavily armed Spanish fleet of 18 ships had landed at the coast, sent by the vengeful governor of Cuba to arrest Cortés and hang him for treason. Forced to divide his already microscopic army, Cortés left a tiny garrison in the capital under his most volatile lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, and sprinted back down to the coast. In a masterpiece of a midnight raid, Cortés ambushed the arresting army, captured their commander, and used the promise of endless Aztec gold to convince the surviving arresting soldiers to join his own ranks. But his triumph turned to ash the moment he marched back into Tenochtitlan. In his absence, Alvarado, driven mad by paranoia over a rumored plot, had locked the gates of the sacred temple during a religious festival and slaughtered the city's unarmed nobility as they danced. The city had finally erupted into total, uncontainable war. The Spaniards were besieged inside their palace. When Cortés forced Moctezuma onto the rooftop to beg his people for a ceasefire, the crowd, disgusted by their captive, broken king, pelted him with heavy stones. Moctezuma died days later, his spirit broken, his empire slipping into chaos. There was no more talking. On the midnight of June 30th, a night immortalized in history as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, the Spaniards attempted a desperate, silent breakout across the rainy western causeway. But a native woman drawing water spotted them, and the great, mournful war drums atop the pyramid began to beat. The dark lake suddenly boiled with thousands of Aztec war canoes. What followed was an apocalyptic slaughter in the mud. The gaps in the causeways became choked with the bodies of horses, Tlaxcalan allies, and Spanish soldiers who had stuffed their pockets so full of stolen gold that they sank straight to the bottom of the lake like stones. Cortés managed to fight his way to the mainland. He sat beneath the sprawling branches of a giant cypress tree, looked back at the bleeding, shattered remnants of his grand expedition, and wept. He had lost over half his men, all of his artillery, most of his horses, and the greatest treasure in the world. By every standard of human history, the story of Hernán Cortés should have ended right there in the mud beneath that tree. Instead, it was the exact moment his terrifying genius truly woke up. Retreating to the safety of Tlaxcala, Cortés did not spend a single day mourning. He began planning the impossible, an amphibious naval invasion of a landlocked mountain city. Over the next year, he had his master shipbuilder construct 13 heavily armed wooden warships. They built the ships in the safety of the forests, disassembled them piece by piece, carried the wooden planks on the backs of 8,000 indigenous porters across 60 miles of jagged mountain terrain, and reassembled them on the shores of the Aztec lake. Armed with these floating gunships to blockade the water and backed by a native coalition that had now swelled to over 100,000 warriors seeking revenge, Cortés systematically cut the freshwater aqueducts feeding the capital. The 93-day siege that followed was a descent into hell. The defenders, now led by the fiercely proud young Emperor Cuauhtémoc, fought for literally every square inch of stone. But they were fighting a two-front war, one against Spanish steel and a far more devastating one against an invisible passenger the Europeans had unwittingly brought with them. Smallpox. The virus swept through the packed, starving island city like a wildfire, killing up to half of the population, sparing neither the highest priest nor the youngest child. On August 13, 1521, the final silence fell over the lake. The magnificent, sparkling city of Tenochtitlan was a leveled, blood-soaked wasteland of rubble. Cuauhtémoc was captured in a small canoe attempting to flee. When brought before the Spanish general, the young king pointed to the heavy dagger at Cortés's belt and begged to be killed. Cortés spared his life, only to hang him during an expedition 4 years later. The Aztec Empire was officially dead. On top of its pulverized, sacred foundations, the Spaniards immediately began laying the heavy stone blocks for a brand new world, Mexico City. Hernán Cortés died back in Spain at the age of 62. He was a wealthy man, but deeply bitter, spending his final years locked in endless, exhausting lawsuits against the Spanish crown, trying to claim the noble titles he felt he was owed. He remains one of history's most difficult, uncomfortable phantoms to categorize. To view him purely as a romantic, swashbuckling underdog ignores the staggering human cost, the broken promises, and the catastrophic erasure of an entire ancient world. But to dismiss his victory as simply the inevitable result of superior European gunpowder ignores the reality of what actually happened on the ground. It was a masterclass in extreme Machiavellian politics, an unshakable psychological iron will, and the absolute exploitation of a fractured native continent. Hernán Cortés proved a terrifying, timeless historical truth that a very small group of people, armed with absolute conviction and a total disregard for the odds, can reach up, grab the sky, and pull it down onto an empire. If this journey into the past has captivated you, don't forget to leave a like. It's the best way to support this project and keep history alive. To continue unraveling the mysteries of the most fascinating figures who ever walked this earth, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss our next trip through time. Until next time.